Today we are going to be talking about biology at the ecosystem level. And what we like to do is kind of talk about what does this topic, ecosystems, have to do with me. And so those of you that own pets, you think like an ecologist. What do I need to give my pet in order to survive? What are the basic essential things that they need? If you want to be a farmer or if you're in the agriculture industry, you are dealing with ecology with soil. You're dealing ecology with weather, and so it's something that becomes basically a part of your everyday routine. If you have a garden, or if you think about having a garden, or your grandma has a garden, you think like an ecologist. And lastly, ecology is literally everywhere. Even in inner city situations, even in urban areas, there is still ecology that takes place. So first of all, we've talked a little bit about our different divisions of ecology. It is broken down in kind of a hierarchy. So we start off with one individual, then we get into a population, so that's of the same species. The community level of ecology takes a look at how living things interact with other living things. And our topic today is on ecosystems, and that takes a look at, yes, the living, but also those non-living things. So things like soil, things like weather, water, and how they influence the area. And eventually we'll get into talking about the biome and biosphere. So first of all, ecology by definition is the study of interactions of living organisms with each other and their physical environment. And so we classify factors based on whether they are living, but it also can be things that come from life or were once living. So we could talk about, for example, leaf litter that's on the bottom of the forest floor. We could talk about a dead log that has fallen in a forest. We could also talk about the waste that is given from an organism. And then abiotic factors, those are the physical things of the environment. So water, weather, rock, soil, and those things that, although they're not living, certainly have an influence on the environment. So let's talk about those biotic factors today, and we classify them based on how they get their energy from the environment. So producers, also known as autotrophs, are the first part of a food chain, and the reason why they're so important is because they are actually able to take the energy from sunlight and convert it into something that is useful, and that usefulness is called glucose, the main sugar that all life is able to absorb and use for energy, at least to a certain degree. And then the other aspect of basically anything that takes something in order to get their food, those are consumers, also known as heterotrophs. And so they might have to consume plants or other animals or some other thing in order to get their energy. Consumers can be broken down on many different levels, but the basic level is what we call herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. So herbivores, they are organisms that eat only plants or other primary producers. It could be algae, it could be seaweed, it could be aquatic plants. Carnivores, they are going to be flesh or meat eaters. So they're going to eat meat or they're going to eat the things that ate the plants. And then lastly, omnivores, they will eat both plants and animals. And so a couple examples of each of these. And we can kind of classify them based on what their teeth are like, what their diet is, of course. But we're seeing, for example, giraffe, deer, rabbits, carnivores. Those would be our top predators. So some of our birds of prey, bald eagles and red-tailed hawks. Here you're seeing a picture of a lion. And then omnivores, they eat both. So this would be, for example, our different types of bear, fox, coyotes, that have a much more open diet. So when we talk about how energy is used in an ecosystem, we say that energy is passed on. And it's passed on, and we classify it based on what we call food chains. And so a food chain is a linear path of where the energy goes. So no matter what food chain you're on, except for a few, for example, deep oceans or caves, the sun is the primary energy source. And sometimes, like in a deep ocean, that energy source still comes indirectly from the sun, although it's not actually casting rays upon it. But let's just say in most cases, the sun is the primary energy source. That first level, called a first trophic level, deals with the passing of energy from one level to next. And so a primary producer, primary first producer, is the first thing that is able to take energy from the sun. Then we get into what's called our primary consumer, or another word to think of it, first eater. That's the second trophic level. So trophic level basically takes a look at how many steps are you away from the sun. And so as we look in our little example here, we go from grass to grasshopper to snake to eagle. We see how the trophic level changes, and also we can classify them based on what level of consumer they are. As that energy is passed on, it only is a fraction of what it started off as. We say it's about 10% as it goes from one link to the next, and we'll get to that momentarily. So food chains can look like a variety of different things, whether we have a land system, whether we have a forested, a grassland, or whether we have an aquatic with either seaweed or algae or something else. It can look different. But one thing that is true is that you're always going to have those primary producers that start off the food chains, and then that energy is passed on from one level to the next. So in this case, we'd say that our green plants are primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, and then at the end we have decomposers, which basically end all food chains. And they are important because even though we think of them as maybe being smelly or ew, gross or nasty, they're super important because they help return whatever nutrients and energy is available back into the soil so that these things can start again. So the food chains take a look at a single chain or lineage on or in an ecosystem, but a food web gives us a more larger and broader scope of what's actually taking place. So in the previous slide, we wouldn't just say that a garter snake only eats grasshoppers. They eat a lot of different things. And so a food web kind of gives us a more complete look at what is doing the eating. And also when we start talking about, a larger food web idea, we could say something like this. Let's say that the green fly population was to go down. Let's say there was a disease and the green fly population would go down. What would happen? Most of us would say, well, the ladybird population will go down because it doesn't have the green fly as its diet. And then we'd also say that the blueberries or berries plants in this case might go up because they have one less predator. But it's not that easy. When we look at a food web, if we ask you, okay, how does the green fly population affect the fox way over here? Well, the reason why we could say that it does affect is, okay, green fly population goes down. That might mean that the berry plants go up, which means that the titmouse bird would go up, which means maybe more prey for the fox and their population would go up. Or we could say, all right, that means that there's also more snakes because there's more of these eggs of the titmouse that the snake could eat. So we see that food webs are nice because they give us a broader scope, a more realistic approach, where a food chain just looks at one lineage, when really that's not the case. Usually, creatures eat a variety in their diet. They're not usually dependent on just one thing. A polar bear, yes, it loves to eat seals, but it also will eat things like beluga whales. It will eat things like birds when the conditions are right and when the seasons change. And so that's why a food web gives us a better approach of what's really taking place. So not only do we deal with that with ecosystems, but another thing that we talk about with ecosystems is how biodiverse they are. So when you have an area that has great temperatures and great amounts of precipitation, usually those are number one and number two most important for an ecosystem really to take off. When you start limiting precipitation, when you start decreasing temperature, that's when the amount of diversity in that area is going to go down. And so if you look at our map here, some of our most biodiverse areas are those right along the equator and those that receive the most moisture. As we get to the poles, there's not as much biodiversity. We also see species that are found only in those areas throughout the map. And so that's kind of another unique thing, and we could talk about adaptation and natural selection with that subject as well. Another topic that we see with ecosystems is invasive species. So these are creatures that are introduced to an area either on purpose or on accident, and they essentially take over an area because they don't have any known predators. And so in our area in Minnesota here, we have a couple different examples that I'm showing you on the slide. The picture of this is called a lamprey. It's kind of this leech-looking thing. It's a parasite that will feed off fish tissue. Here you have what's called the emerald ash borer, which, as you know, with ash trees, we're cutting a lot of those down because of this creature, the emerald ash borer. It really gets inside the bark of ash trees and kind of messes up with how well the plant can send sugars throughout their bodies and their tissues. And then another plant example that you're seeing here is what's called a common buckthorn. It's an invasive species from Europe that really takes over an area. It outcompetes because it can tolerate shaded areas better. And unfortunately, it outcompetes a lot of our native species like oak and maple, and what you're seeing here is an aspen. And so that can have a really big effect on an area. Sometimes when you get these invasive species, the ones that are worst are invasive species that affect the lower line parts of a food chain, because as we talked about in our food web slide, if you're messing around with some of these producers, that affects all of these creatures up here. So if you're going to have an invasive in your area, if you had to choose, you'd want to choose some of those top predators. But invasive species overall are not usually good to have. All right? And so let's get into our last topics today. And so when we talk about these food chains and food webs, trophic levels talk about where it is compared to the sun. So as we've said, primary producers, usually plants, are what we call our primary producers and our first trophic level. They are able to harness about 10% of the energy from the sun. Then, as we go to our primary consumers, in this case we have our cricket or a grasshopper, it will take 10% of the energy from that plant. And then 10% goes to the mouse, and then 10% goes to the rattlesnake. Now, what does this all mean? Here's what I want you to think of. When you were little, let's say you had an ice cream cone. How much of that ice cream cone is still left in your body? The answer is not very much. You have used that energy for yourself, doing things like walking, maintaining homeostasis, eating more food. And so that's why we say only about 10% of the energy that is passed on from one trophic level to the next is able to, because that creature uses it for its day-to-day life. So energy flows and is lost where nutrients are actually going to cycle. And that's a big deal as we get into later parts of this chapter. Another way that we can think of that is called bioaccumulation. And DDT in eagles is one of the most common, but we also see this with mercury. We also see this with lead. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about DDT in ospreys and DDT in eagles. What happens was it was a chemical that was applied to fields by farmers. It got into the water, and that wasn't as big of a deal, but what happened was little microorganisms started to pick that up in their tissues. Then those primary consumers started to consume the algae and started to consume the other things in the water. Then smaller fish consumed mass amounts of those invertebrates. Big fish, they start to eat more of those little fish. And then finally, as it gets into that top predator, there gets to be more and more in that tissue. So what happened with the bald eagles is it actually caused their eggs to become almost leathery instead of like a chicken egg, kind of a hard egg to like crack. And so a lot of their young didn't survive. They'd actually dry out and die. And so the United States banned the use of DDT by farmers, and that's why the bald eagle population, among other predatory birds, has really rebounded. So that's a topic called bioaccumulation. So that concludes our discussion today on ecosystems. Hope you've learned a lot, and we'll talk soon.